The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Well, thank you, Lysandra. Looking forward to today's episode. I think it's going to be quite an interesting episode for us to discuss and for our listeners to hear the different opinions, international opinions on this.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I just hope we can fit everything we want in the time that we've got.
That's always a challenge for us.
Yeah.
I'm especially excited for this episode as well. I think I'm going to learn a lot from you both. So kind of kicking right in, what is the purpose of carbon tax and carbon regulation? So this is kind of what we're basing our episode on. And I think our listeners have been kind of hearing this in our other episodes. We refer to carbon tax, we refer to carbon regulation. What's the purpose of it? And let's dive in there.
Can I suggest for John to start up? And why I'm saying that for our listeners is the European and the UK have been much more advanced in this area longer than we have. I think there's a lot people are going to glean based on John's point of view, and I can add based on our brief experience here in North America as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to do that. Although I have to put the warning on is that the UK is no longer part of the European Union. But that in itself becomes interesting because of how we are managing that transition on issues like this. Okay, what's the purpose of carbon tax and carbon regulation? That is the key question. I think the starting point has to be with that is tax and regulation are two of the main tools that any government uses to change the behaviour of the people that it governs. I know that sounds a big political view of it, but if you think about it, you either tell people they can or can't do things by regulation and law. So that's one thing you do. You change their behaviour in the other way by saying, if you do something, we'll give you money, or if you do something, we'll charge you money. So you do that. So that's the big things. And then increasingly, although I'm not sure how effective it is, numbers of jurisdictions are talking about what they call nudging, and this is where they provide some kind of mild pressure, some kind of light incentive, some kind of education to change behaviour. So given that, why are they doing it on carbon? And I think the simple answer to that is they're all waking up to the climate situation, crisis, whatever we want to call it. I think the fact that we may be facing chaotic climate change is fair grounds to perhaps call it a climate crisis. They see what's happening and they wonder whether it's happening fast enough. I think equally, they are charged with the thing, what are we as a government doing to support this? Because they say, yes, we support the COP26 or whatever. So how do you deliver something? And one of the easiest ways for governments to deliver something is to go back and tax something or change people's behaviour some way or the other. I was picking up on my news feed this morning that in Quebec, they're talking about taxing people who do not get vaccinated. And so this is another illustration of how governments can use taxation. And if you think about it with vaccination, they've encouraged us, they've provided the vaccination, but they've still got some people who haven't done it. In New York, they've offered people $100 to get vaccinated. Quebec, it looks like almost they're doing the opposite. So that's how government plays out. And of course, we've got energy and carbon is one of the things that they're using these tools and mechanisms to deal with.
If I could, I'd like to, for our listeners, because past podcasts, we've been talking about what the end user can do and how they can be involved. In this particular situation, we're talking about a key stakeholder being the government involved in driving this and taking up what John said. The idea is to set a policy or some framework to engage or ensure clients or customer, the marketplace actually does take action, because clearly science-based evidence that the carbon emissions are having a huge impact, as John indicated. I'm bringing this up, which was not discussed amongst us before we started this, but I'm interested, John, how the UK/Europe, why they tend to be so far ahead of North America. And I'm just going to float this. I think one rationale that I can answer why is that in North America, we have an abundance of energy per se. We have a lot of it available to us. And I'm wondering if that has slowed us down or impacted our thought process in driving or reducing carbon emissions, which is different from the UK because I know you have energy, but you may not have as much as what we sell, not only in North America, but also sell around the world. And I'm amidst why you think what your perspective would be why Europeans or the UK have been advanced in this area.
Thanks for the advance warning on that question.
I thought I thought I'd give you that.
No, I'm more than happy to tackle that. I actually think North America, from my experience of it, has been part of a low energy cost economy. You know, we've only had to look at the difference. I mean, your energy can be 2 to 3 times cheaper than it is over here in Europe. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing, and I'm going to be, again, we're going to have to keep touching on political issues when we're talking about this. I think sometimes the use of regulation and taxation in these areas may depend on the flavour of the government. So, for example, if we have a very right-wing government, and I'm going to use the example of the US under Donald Trump, we saw him come out of the Paris Agreement, want to allow coal to develop, and basically going, go on marketplace, do what you want, that's the best for America. So you can have that kind of approach. When you move more towards the left of the spectrum, there seems to be more about social care, responsibility for society and things like that. And that perhaps leads to a greater desire to act. So I think it's a combination of two. I think it's the fact that energy prices, and as you often talk about, the price signals, you know, because you're spending more on it, you think to yourself, oh, you know, I've got to do something about it. I mean, I always remember one of my first trips to Canada and looking at the price of your gas and the fuel economy of your cars. And it was funny, I did a quick calculation and I thought, that works out, you're perhaps spending the same as us because you're paying less for your fuel, but you've got less fuel efficient cars. So, you know, it's very difficult when you're looking at behaviours like that. But I think that it is a combination of price and I think, shall I say, political aspiration.
Yes. And I'm wondering too, your comments and what I said earlier, because, you know, you've had interruptions in energy supply and in Europe and in the UK. So people are a lot more sensitized to energy and the impact of energy. In North America, we sort of take it for granted, one, because it's low cost, but I would also say to you, the reliability and access to energy is, we sort of just take it for granted, right?
Yeah, I think, and again, this is drifting off the topic ever so slightly, but it's interesting. Of course, you talk about interruptions we had. Historically, some of the biggest interruptions we had was when we had a coal miners' strike. And we had a much more coal-based economy. And I can remember having to we worked a 3-day week when the government said, you know, in order to conserve energy, we will only work 3 days a week. And it's funny in a way that was because we lacked a very high carbon fuel. So it tells you how things move on. I think potential interruptions now are slightly more geopolitically scary because we are dependent on, let's not mince words, Russia in providing gas, and Russia can use that as a political tool if it wants to.
And they
would. And I'm not saying anything against the Russian government. I've worked in Russia and I've known some very nice Russians, but immense piece of power if you have the control of an energy supply to another country.
Well, I'll be bold and say I think they are using it as a significant tool to get their way. So,
yeah.
But I have not worked in Russia, and now I may never work in Russia.
That's true. You may never get a visa. But I think what we're actually saying here is that we don't talk about this often, but energy is a geopolitical issue. And, you know, it's quite difficult to not bring, and I hasten to add, I don't think at any point in this podcast are we going to bring in, should we say, current politicians necessarily, Apologies about mentioning the US president, but he's not a current politician, but we have to think about how governments operate, because what we're saying is this is government's role in addressing climate change. Coming back to our topic, what we've come round to is they set policies, and the tools that they use for that could be incentives, taxation, and regulation.
Great.
I do think also carbon tax and carbon regulation heavily depends on the country's citizens and what they're used to. For
Yes.
instance, in North America, we're very big, we're known as being consumers. And I'm sure in the UK also, you're consumers, but not to the extent of North America. And you can even see that, when they compare our McDonald's size meals from UK versus US and things like that. So if you kind of translate that to how we consume energy, I would say there might be a parallel there. I also think thinking back to COP26, we were talking some statistics and thinking about some countries heavily depend on their government to come up with these laws and these rules. And I think that's kind of where we see the difference in carbon tax and carbon regulation between country to country, because again, each country is going to have different expectations of their government.
I think you touch on a very valid point there, that in a democracy, a government can only govern and do things in the longer term that the electorate are happy to live with. I know they may cause problems in the short term, and I know there's issues about whether you're proportional representation or whatever, but in the bigger picture, you're quite right. If you have a population that is used to being taxed, it's quite easy to tax them further. If you have one that sees taxes as the work of the devil, then they are going to push back, and therefore it's going to be harder to implement.
This discussion is really timely because, the goal, I think, around the world is to get to net zero by 2050.
Yes.
Certainly there's discussions about people, organizations, or society getting to 50% of that by 2030. And we're having this discussion because the question is, how are we going to get there? Is the marketplace going to be able to move there themselves, which I'd love to think would be the case. I'm not convinced that actually is going to happen without proper government involvement. So now the question is, how does the government get involved? Regulation or by sending the pricing signals, a cost to carbon. But I was really and still would. I like it when customers can decide and make decisions, because they can make, in my view, my personal experience, they tend to make better decisions that are suited to their needs versus being dictated what to do, which may not actually serve them well and may cost more money. But I where I'm going with this is I think something has to happen, because I'm not convinced today, 2022, that we're actually going to get to 50% reduction by 2030. I don't know. I mean, that's why we're having this discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, I think as well. I think a few I will put in is of certain people who operate in this field that believe that you're right, market forces ought to be able to work, but that historically we have not paid the real price for energy supplies. And when you can buy a litre of fuel for gas for about the same price as a litre of water, bottled water, you have to start saying something's not quite right with the system. And so government is in its way, is saying the market isn't working properly at charging the proper price for energy, taking account of its environmental impact. Therefore, we will interfere with the market, and that's what they are doing by putting that on. The problem is that very often government interference in markets doesn't necessarily bring the best result.
Right.
Diving right in, what is carbon tax, and can you provide an example?
A brief history of carbon tax in the UK would be one way of looking at it. Some time ago, and we're saying with early action, we introduced a tax called the Climate Change Levy, CCL. And this is basically charged on natural gas, electricity, propane, coal, the major energy sources. And the idea of it was put on the energy bill as an additional charge. All right. And it was per kilowatt hour or per unit of supply. And we still have that in place. And the government introduced that. Now, when it introduced it, it couldn't introduce it at such a level that would get everybody doing something, because that would have been unpleasant. But it tried to introduce it at a reasonable level. So when it came in, let's say for electricity, it added about 10% to the cost of electricity, which they would hope is enough for people to do something with it. Now, part of the problem is that prices become volatile. What's 10% changes and people get used to it. So that was put in. But then there was a great deal of pushback from large industry, and large industry said, do you want large energy users, energy intensive industries, do you want them to leave the UK? So the government then came up with what they call climate change agreements. And the idea of this was, if you signed up to one of those with specific energy targets, and they could be absolute targets, i.e. the total amount of energy, or energy intensity targets, that's energy per unit of production. If you agree to do those over a 10-year period, you would then get an 80% discount on your tax. And so they did that. Then they introduced another program called Carbon Reduction Commitment, which required organisations over a certain size to have to buy their carbon emissions each year. This was not a full-blown trading scheme. It looked like a trading scheme because you had to declare how many tonnes and pay for it, but it was a fixed rate. I don't know if the same is true in North America. We have always had a degree of tax or duty on road fuel, gas for your car. There's always been an element in there. And that's one of the reasons why our fuel prices are much higher than yours, given that we all buy oil on the global market. So that's a bit of an example of carbon tax. The interesting thing about a carbon tax is, at what point do you apply it and what do you relate it to? So the solution here was to say the easiest thing is to put it on utility bills and relate it to the kilowatt hours on the utility bill. That way, the utility companies became responsible for administering and collecting the tax. And interestingly, what most of them did was put the tax as a separate line on the utility bill, which we would have thought would have been great news. But as we've talked about in previous podcasts, a lot of people just don't look at the information that's on their utility bill. They may look at the total sum, pay it, and not understand that a chunk of it is in fact a carbon tax.
So, you touched upon something that I think is really important, is transparency. So let's just talk about in Canada specifically. One of the jurisdictions that was really leading in this area is province of British Columbia. They were the first ones that incorporated carbon tax. And as you suggested, John, although it would be debatable depending on the people you speak to, the price that they were being charged wasn't high enough, or it was too high, depending on who you spoke to. And then also, I also did a little research, and again, depending on who you read, it's been favorable and very helpful, or it actually hasn't done anything. So it really depends who you're reading the document from. Fast forward, Canada now is moving towards requiring federally and provincially, they can do their own thing, but they have to get close to $170 a ton for carbon. Now, there is exceptions, as you noted. There's some large users that may have a certain size of carbon emissions that they're under a different plan from what is this $170 ton scenario. And the reason and rationale for that is exactly what you just said, is, that could put them in a position where they couldn't be competitive and force them out of the market. So the governments in different provinces are developing programs to make sure it accommodates that type of thing. I'm sure listeners are going, okay, so great. Is it working? I think one of the challenges is you need time. It may even take, 3 to 5 years to actually determine if it's actually working. But I love the idea because it truly does put a cost, an internal cost, within the organization. So when they're making decisions, financial decisions, improvements, things of that nature, they can factor that as a cost that needs to be calculated when they're doing a return on investment and making changes. And I like it being transparent versus regulation where people have no idea of what cost it is because they never map out how much time they spend in regulating stuff. So I think certainly that seems to be a pathway that we're doing here in Canada. In the US, you've touched on it. That's a country that does not like taxes. And so anything I've read, the Republican Party, if they're going to do something on carbon, they actually think a tax is probably the way to go, or there's carbon credits. So if someone spends money and they reduce it, they get credit. Summary, what I guess it can be complex. And the problem is the complexity reduces the effectiveness of it. And so whatever government does, I think we'd like to say the clearer and the cleaner it would be, the better. And the other thing I want to say, John, because you've talked about this in many presentations with us here in Canada, one thing I really like about the UK perspective is you have it embedded. So if there's a change of government, it doesn't unwind everything that you've done, which I don't know if I've captured that correctly, but I like that kind of thought process.
At a high level, it's embedded. Changes of government. I mean, we've seen in moving from a Labour government to a Conservative government, we've seen a lightening in the response to what's going on. But the fundamental thing of having a carbon budget in 5-yearly tranches and things like that, that is built into legislation and would require overturning. I listening to this, and I've just suddenly had a thought, the idea that we could have a global level of tax. I mean, that would be the other approach. We all agree that there's so much tax we put on a ton of carbon, i.e. a global price of carbon. Too complicated and politically difficult. So I've come up with an idea and I've shot it down. But there you go.
It would be a brilliant move, though. I mean, there is discussion about, and I'm going to state it incorrectly, but where if you're purchasing a product from a different jurisdiction and the carbon that's used to make that product, there'll be a tax associated with it. I forget the term, John. That's
yes, yeah. You're absolutely right, and there's a lot of concern about it, but it's a borders mechanism.
Yes,
that's being talked about. Yes.
Which my research is the UK was doing that, testing it this summer. I think Canada was watching with very closely. I don't know if it went ahead because of the pandemic, but I know Canada is looking at doing the same thing. I think the US is challenged.
Well, they would.
Yeah.
But I mean, interesting on that. And again, looking at the global thing, where do we get most of our manufactured products from?
China.
And that would mean then that there would be effectively, China would see what is a trade barrier being put in place on their products. And again, we get back to geopolitics about how you work this.
And consumers would see higher pricing.
Yes. And let's be honest, there are very few people who care so much about the climate and the world that they're prepared to significantly change their lifestyle or spend significantly more on the lifestyle that they've got.
I do have a quick question. It's a bit of a simple one. So when we're talking carbon tax, does it simply deal with carbon dioxide emissions? Does it also include methane and there's nitrous oxide, all those other greenhouse gas emitters, or is carbon tax strictly for carbon dioxide emissions?
I think that's a good question. And again, the simple answer is it depends on who's framing it. I mean, the easiest way of looking at that with the data that we use here, you could either say that the tax is based on CO2 or CO2 equivalent, and therefore, including the others. I think for the case of simplicity, that generally the approach is taken that carbon is the biggest single emitter, and it's generally related to energy carbon. We have a landfill tax in this country, which you could argue is a way of taxing the methane that's coming off a landfill, although it's not strictly under our heading that way. I think a government may well take the old Pareto, the 80-20 rule, that if we hit energy carbon, we know, The carbon coming from energy is about 80% roughly of the total GHG emissions. So if you can hit that quick and simply, when you start looking at what we call the scope 1 emissions, that, the emissions that you have control of directly on your site, refrigeration gases are one of those. But the approach there has been very much one of regulation and phasing out and making certain gases illegal, because you can do that because there are alternatives. You can't phase out natural gas and make it illegal yet.
Yes. Sir, that's a good analogy, John, of why they may do price signals, put a price on carbon versus regulation on that. That's a really good analogy.
And I want to make sure to clarify. So when you mentioned CO2 equivalent, that's when they take another gas and basically equate those emissions in terms of CO2. So it's CO2 emissions are basically the standard when we're talking about carbon tax.
Yes. So if you were looking actually when you burn natural gas as well, you could say there's the CO2 emissions from it, but there may be some other emissions as well, and you could include those in. But if you like, I don't want to use the word the gold standard because that's not quite right. But carbon dioxide is if you like, the base currency in looking at greenhouse gas emissions, I think is the way to look at it. It's a bit like the dollar, the US dollar is becoming the global way that you look at money across jurisdictions. Even more so, I think, with carbon. For clarity, we have to be careful when we're talking about carbon and carbon dioxide, because there's a factor of 12 difference if you're doing your chemistry. But generally, user level, we're talking CO2. When we go to global level, we normally are talking carbon. But as long it's one of those things, as long as you know which one you're talking about, you're okay.
We already mentioned a few of these, but what are carbon tax challenges? And one I really find interesting is finding out who is responsible for the carbon tax. I think it's interesting how each country takes a look at it different, and we already kind of mentioned it. Is it the manufacturer? Is it the person extracting the natural gas? Is it the consumer when they get that finished product? And so that's kind of one I can think of, but I'd be interested to throw this question around.
Do you want to start with that one, Dave?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I actually think if it nets out to the consumer, they'll start deciding on if, again, the word pricing signal, they see it. I think the world moves because of costs and what's available in the marketplace and what's available to consumers. So I think consumers will, and they're already starting to drive their behavior in this area. Sandra, you've been very clear on this because of your status and where you are. So I think driving it to the consumer is an effective way. There is a challenge is that sometimes when you have business to business relationships, how do you sometimes they're not driven the same way as when they're selling to a consumer directly. So that's where when you start hitting them on the bottom line by putting a carbon tax on with the energy that they use, then they start seeing it a little clearer. That's my perspective. I do want to, one thing you were asking, what are the problems? I think most customers, we work with a lot of customers that are big energy users. Many aren't really aware of the carbon costs, and they're not aware of the future carbon costs on how that impacts their business place. So that's how do you, if they don't know that, how can they start making forward decisions? So that I think that's education is required quite a bit in that side. That's would be my point. John?
Yeah, I think you touch on a very interesting element of how you implement a tax. Whatever you're going to do, and I think Dave's right, that wherever the tax is applied, it's going to hit the consumer, be they residential or commercial or whatever, at the end. So one of the things that government will look at is what to them is an efficient way of collecting it. So in the UK, for example, let's just stick with electricity. Instead of saying, I'll tell you what, you buy the electricity and then you, the consumer, have to pay a tax bill back to the government. I thought, no, that doesn't work nicely. That doesn't. Then there could have been going to the generator and saying to the generator, right, you now apply the tax to the energy and supply it to the utility. The problem with that is that cost then gets shared over everybody. So, for example, with our climate change levy, it doesn't apply to a residential customer. So what you've done there is you've increased the cost for everybody and you make that complicated. So the view there was, if the utility does it, they know what kind of customer they're serving, so therefore they can charge at the appropriate rate. Now, of course, the utilities then slightly complain that they are becoming an unpaid tax collector. But then we have that with here VAT, there HST. Businesses have to collect tax and pay it to government on behalf of the government. So yes, it's at the end, I think Dave and I are in total agreement. The impact of the tax has to come to the consumer, the user of the energy or the carbon emitting substance.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.